God, holy and undivided Trinity. I often find when I read or hear a story from the Bible, my mind wanders to the edges of the story. Often there is so much that must have gone on behind the scenes or off the stage before we happen upon the characters. There are often so many unanswered questions. And the questions fire my imagination and pull me in and make what could be an abstract intellectual exercise something I can feel at a gut level, something that makes my faith real. Which is not to say I believe that every story in the Bible occurred exactly as written. That if I had followed Jesus and the others around with a camcorder all his life, things would have played out exactly as written in the Gospels. But it is to say that I believe every story to be a priceless jewel and to be true. True not as we wise, sophisticated, modern people understand truth, but true as the ancients knew the stories to be. Stories that were so true, they were how you framed your life, how you made sense of it. Stories you knew to be true because of how you responded to them. This morning's story is hands down one of my favorites for digging around the periphery. Who were these wise ones, kings, who lived in the time of Herod, the father of the Herod who would participate in Jesus' execution? And what started them on their journey? Despite the fact that tradition has always held there were 3 of them, that number doesn't appear anywhere in the story. And the names the 3 have been given, Caspar, Melchior, and Balthazar, are most definitely not in the story we just heard. It is likely true that however many they were not kings at all. They were mystics, astrologers, dream interpreters, and Gentiles, meaning non-Jews. Whoever they were, they left what they were doing, left their lives, and set off in search of something so big, so life-changing, they were willing to venture into the unknown, willing to spend months riding on a camel, tracking down whatever it was. And though I have always thought of them as a group or a posse who set off together, the story does not tell us that either. Perhaps they met up somewhere on the road after each had been traveling a long time. They sat down near each other for a meal at a roadside inn. And when Caspar asked Melchior what he was doing roaming the lands on a camel, and Melchior described the dream he'd had about a new king who was to be born and who would change the world and bring peace to all people, well, Caspar almost choked on his grilled cheese sandwich, hearing his exact dream described by this stranger. And then Balthazar, who was at the next table, leaned over and said, "Excuse me, I couldn't help but overhear. This is the strangest thing." And then, of course, they traveled together after that, each with the same dream in his head, pulling them forward. And while they were not sure exactly where they were going, they were pretty sure that Jerusalem, that great and glittering city, that golden city of temples and towers, stockbrokers, department stores, and universities, they were pretty sure that would be the place to start, and probably the place they would find what they were looking for. So they pull their camels up to Herod's palace, hand the reins over to the valet, and request an audience with the ruler. And Herod, he was sitting slumped down in his throne, bored to tears with these public audiences he had to endure. It was his least favorite part of the whole ruling thing. Although the endless parade of people telling him how powerful and fabulous he was had its charms, He got tired of sitting in that chair for so long and would much rather be counting his money or planning which relative he could bump off next so he could have more lands to rule. And so he half listened while these foreigners began to speak, laughing to himself about their strange speech patterns. And then one of them, might have been Caspar, Herod later couldn't really remember, began to talk about a baby king, a king who had just been born somewhere in Herod's territory. And Herod was suddenly very much awake and alert, although he fought hard not to look too eager to the kings. "Well," Herod said, "I'm fairly sure no kings have been born in Jerusalem lately." "Oh," said Balthasar, "well, perhaps he wasn't born in Jerusalem." "Nonsense," thought Herod. "Where else would a king be born?" But just to be sure, he summoned his scribes and priests and asked them to search the scripture for any scripture that might give him a clue. Melchior cleared his throat. "Actually, Your Majesty," he said, "the prophet Micah, while I know he was not one of the rock stars of prophecy, he did talk about a ruler who would shepherd the people Israel coming out of Bethlehem in the land of Judah, which, if my calculations are correct, is only about 9 miles from here." "Well, well," said Herod, turning to his priests with a look that could kill and saying, "I'm just fascinated that this is the first I'm hearing of this." And then back to Melchior saying, "Go on. Tell me more." Melchior glanced briefly around at Caspar and Balthasar, who appeared to be feeling as uncomfortable as he was, and said, "Well, really, that's about all we know at this point, but we are hoping to find this king and pay him our respects." "What a fine idea," oozed Herod. "Perhaps when you have found him, you will let me know exactly where he is, so I can give him his due reward." Well, the wise ones took off from Herod's palace as fast as politeness would allow. And leaving behind all that glittered, they approached Bethlehem. And the star that had been before them the whole way suddenly began to shimmer and elongate until it was pointing directly at a really sorry-looking stable. "Surely," thought the wise ones, "this cannot be right." But having trusted the dream and the star for so long, they went inside. And there they found not an impressive-looking monarch surrounded by jewels and gold, but a little helpless baby surrounded by his loving parents and some animals. And they realized immediately that their gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh were really not what this little king needed. That what was really needed in this life was the unconditional love they could see in the eyes of his parents, who gazed adoringly at their little treasure. And they realized immediately, being wise and all, that their notions of power, prestige, what was really important in the world, had been turned upside down. And they understood in a whole new way the words of the prophet Micah, who spoke of the birth of a king who would offer an alternative to the learning of all the sages of the court and all the power of national rulers. And they saw that the way of wealth, with its subsequent twisted notion of self-sufficiency, was wildly off base, that to truly possess wealth was to become vulnerable and helpless, like this little baby, this little king. And they saw that the violence justified by rulers to preserve and expand their power was corrupt and empty. And having learned much, much more than they ever could have dreamed possible, and carrying with them the light of the star and the image of this little Redeemer, they left. What they had seen and felt was more than enough to last a lifetime. more than enough for them to rearrange their lives, shape their lives around this story, this encounter with pure love. And they went home by another way, partly as the story is told, to avoid having to pass through Jerusalem and see Herod again, that ruler who gave them a really creepy feeling they just could not shake. But partly because they just couldn't go home the same way, because they were no longer the same people. Because once you have heard a story like this, you simply must go home by another way. May it be so.